welcome to Under the Hood. We're now in our third year. Unbelievable. And I have this wonderful guest today. Lori and I have met at conferences and we've talked and we've chatted and we've, you know, just kind of told stories to one another and all the challenges that women go through as leaders. And very specifically that Lori has had so much experience in dealing with all kinds of situations. So Under the Hood is always about patterns that are created in childhood impact us as grown-ups. So let me read you a little bit about my guest, Lori. Lori, I always get them mixed up. Lori Adams Brown or Lori Brown Adams.
Adams
Adams
Brown.
Brown.
It's alphabetical.
That's what I
Yeah.
was just going to put it in.
AB.
AB.
Yeah.
All right. So Lori is an accomplished executive in global talent development, and she specializes in designing innovative future of work talent programs that integrate AI, big thing right now, and human-centered approaches. What a concept. With a proven track record in executive upskilling, I love that word, upskilling, AI-enabled coaching, and inclusive succession planning, she has led global leadership summits and driven workforce transformation, embedding emotional intelligence at scale. Now, that's really a challenge coming from my background. Yes, many people. So she brings 20 years of leadership experience building high performance, agile, and psychologically safe workforces across the Americas, EMEA, and APAC. She specializes in designing scalable leadership pipelines, executive development strategies, and workforce transformation programs that align human capital with business innovation. That's a mouthful, and it's just incredible because it's so important. Everything that you do is what you and I have talked about is highly specialized and really, really important in today's environment. So my first question to you, given that we know that the world is incredible turmoil, conflict is everywhere. We have inner conflicts, we have outer conflicts, we have conflicts between our people that we work with, that we work for. And my assumption, again, my theory, and it's not just mine, dealing with conflict, dealing with a lot of these difficult situations starts back in our early childhood. And not to therapize, because this is not a therapy session, but I do want to bring out that personal growth and development starts with becoming aware of who you are and what your patterns are, right? We can't solve a problem unless we know what the problem is or what it's about. So it doesn't have to be a problem. So let's just start with some of the good news. Tell us a little bit about your background and things that, patterns that you created that have helped you to be where you are.
Sure. Yeah. And thank you so much for the honor of being here. Hi to all of your audience, wherever you're listening. I would say that it's important to know about me in my background is that I was raised in multiple cultures.
Mhm.
So, born in the US, raised in Costa Rica and Venezuela in international schools from my elementary school years all the way through when I graduated from high school. And so I think growing up with friends and teachers from around the world in these settings really formed me as a person to be, I think, have a global mindset. Nobody knows everything about every culture in the world, but it gave me a lot of curiosity because of the friends that I would go over to their houses and eat their food they ate or see the religious practices they had. And everybody's culture was so different and beautiful and unique. And so that formed me as a person, I think, to give me both the curiosity and more of this mindset that there's many ways to live this human life. And I find people very fascinating. So I ended up as an undergraduate, a double major in sociology and Spanish. I grew up speaking Spanish fluently, but it gave me a chance to read a lot of the literature, which I found really fascinating. And then I went on to get a master's in intercultural studies and then went straight to Indonesia to work in a nonprofit straight out of grad school here in the Bay Area. And worked alongside the Ministry of Education in Indonesia in a very rural province called Aceh province, where just before the tsunami hit, I had switched to a community development nonprofit, ended up full on disaster relief, learning a lot of skills in real
Yes.
time in high stakes, rapidly changing environments alongside the UN coordination efforts. And I would say there was any part of my leadership journey that I learned in a trial by
Hmm.
fire in a very fast paced situation, it was that. And lots of conflict between different worldviews, all kinds of stories along those lines. But I think that what I also learned in that time was the beauty of people coming together and really listening to understand one another in order to serve people who were traumatized
Yes.
and needed help. And there was a lot of beauty there. I went on to Singapore and worked there 10 years, which is the most religiously diverse
Hmm.
nation in the world. So worked in a lot of bridge building efforts and that type of thing. And then landed here in Silicon Valley about 6 years ago. And I currently work in a global tech company over all of our talent development and training. And I really
Yeah. So
just love the work
obviously
that I
we can
do.
see the thread, right? From early
Yeah.
from early on. What about your family? Your parents? You have siblings, or
Yeah.
what was that like?
hmm Yeah, so I'm a middle child, so we can therapize that if we want. I'm an only daughter, also lots to therapize there. So, yeah. So lots of opportunity to learn conflict resolution as I was growing up, of course. And my parents are both worked in nonprofits.
Mm.
So, and very, I would say I grew up in a home where giving back to the community was just is a core
Hmm.
value. So, and the work was always more than work for my parents. So it was a
Hmm.
passion, it was a lifestyle. And so that, at least on my father's side, was a bit of workaholism for
Hmm.
sure, definitely workaholism. So that's something as an adult I've had to process for myself to try to create some strong boundaries, especially in a well, international
Yes.
disaster relief could trigger that. And then also working in Silicon Valley tech companies. So definitely have had to work through some of those patterns because I love what I do.
Mhm.
And so sometimes those are the most at risk for overwork and burning out. And then on my mom's side, you know, she did a lot of nonprofit work as well, and then ended up in her later years becoming the director of border health in the state of New Mexico, working alongside the governor of New Mexico under the Obama administration. And so flying back and forth between the US and Mexico, coordinating these meetings. So, like, even in my adult years, I think I've been very inspired by her work and who she is as a person. Definitely one of my, you know, greatest leadership mentors and models for sure. She's definitely just a very wholehearted leader.
Yes,
So,
it sounds like it, and it sounds like a very unique background to take you to this unique place that you're in and the strengths that you have. So you kind of alluded a little bit about some of the things that some of the patterns that you had to kind of look at, given the nature of your big heart and the nature of your giving. Tell us a little bit about that.
yes. So I think that as I've gotten older and further into my career, one of the things I've noticed is um, sometimes, and I've done a little bit of research on this
Hmm.
too, and I've explored it a bit on my podcast with different guests. Sometimes there are people in the world that when they see somebody thriving or doing well in their career, especially being a wholehearted type of leader, they can become a target
Hmm.
of those who seek
Oh, yes.
to I don't know whether they see them as a threat or maybe a source of something they want.
Hmm.
So trying to suck out their goodness into themselves somehow. Also, it's true if you're an underperformer, I think sometimes you get targeted. Being apparently under the radar and the quiet quitters are the safe ones out there. But I've never been able to be those, so I don't know.
Somebody said to me a long
Um,
time ago, Laura, you're too high profile.
yeah, exactly. Yes. And so, yeah, that's something I've had to work through. I am one of those people that a few years ago just sort of built my own personal board of advisors. You know, I have a therapist, I have a career
Hmm.
coach, an executive coach, I have a spiritual director. I have women that I have sort of chosen for their different expertise who speak into my life and will tell me the
Hmm.
truth, my truth tellers, you know, and these are my ride or
Hmm.
dies. And so, that's been helpful for me because I think that one of the things I learned along the way is that, you know, you can have a choice to stop doing good in the world, stop
Hmm.
being this emotionally intelligent, culturally intelligent leader who's, you know, trying to do this
Hmm.
at scale for people. So my choices have sometimes been, do I keep being this type of leader, or do I start being too harsh and, not being empathetic?
Mhm.
But one of my favorite quotes from one of the leaders that I most admire in the world is Jacinda Ardern, who was the Prime Minister of New Zealand for many
Mm.
years during the time I was in Singapore. And so I really followed her career and how she led. And one of the things that she often said was a quote along the lines of, I refuse to believe that a leader can't be both compassionate and
Mhm.
strong. And so I've sort of kept that as a mantra,
Mhm.
that I don't want to step back just because sometimes you can be targeted for being a kind,
Yes.
compassionate, empathetic
Yes.
leader. I think that we have an edge, but we also sometimes get targeted.
Well, I have a saying about leadership. You have about as much room as a crease on a pair of pants. Every group wants a leader, and every group wants to kill the leader off. If you've, really kind of studied group dynamics, it's actually it's like an acumen. It's there, right? And so what you're talking about, again, many years I had a spiritual teacher who gave us this analogy. He called it about the great bear mother. Sometimes she nurtures her cubs, and sometimes she smacks them and sends them out of the cave. And it's all love.
Yeah.
It's all love, right?
Mm.
And so, kind of again, when I was working with women with eating disorders, there was somebody who coined the term the nurturing authoritative parent. So knowing when to be nurturing and when to be authoritative. We become too authoritative, and then we get really targeted. We become too democratic, and we're seen as weak, right?
Yeah. And in the West and in the East and in the South, it's all very
Mm-hmm.
different because I've lived in all these
Mm-hmm.
places. And so, like what works for leadership in Singapore, for example, is a little bit different from Indonesia, but they're much closer to each other than the
Mm-hmm.
US is to Singapore or Indonesia. So, and then Venezuela and Costa Rica, growing up with more collectivist mindset, collectivist values around leadership. And then in Asia, very strong leadership expectation of humility. Whereas in the US, it's very
Mm-hmm.
opposite. Even if people have phrases in their company that say humble, or it just looks very
Mm-hmm.
different than it does in, Southeast Asia. So, living in Southeast Asia for 20 years, and I always voted as a US citizen abroad, whether I mailed it in from Banda Aceh and just hope
All
it made it
right.
in the hanging Chad era or whatever. But when we would see US presidents come visit Indonesia, for example, it's from the Indonesian perspective. You just, you expect other Asian leaders to be very humble, even their body language of how they
Mm-hmm.
make eye contact or not, or the height between two people. And so the US just always has this very expectation that you're strong and dogmatic and taller and bigger. And that, you know, coming from Singapore to here, even though I'm a US citizen, 6 years ago, I've had to really adapt to that, and I'm still working on
Mm-hmm.
it. And there's a lot of nuance there, and some of it, I've had to question, does this go against my values to assimilate to this
Mm-hmm.
way? And those are questions we all have to ask, whether we're crossing cultures or not. But they've certainly been a part of my journey because of how cross-cultural my
Right.
life and my work currently is.
Right.
Yeah.
So what I'm thinking about when you're talking about this, a couple things. One is the signals that we get from within that kind of like, don't cross that boundary, don't cross, or this is a dangerous place, or this is a dangerous place. So how have you been, and I think you know what I'm talking about, just that instinct when we get triggered, it's like, my guess is that you would have to think about it. Then you would have to take it up here and kind of be very logical about it. Where am I? Yeah.
Yeah, I think my personality, well, Myers-Briggs wise, I'm a strong T,
Mm-hmm.
so I'm an ESTP on the
Mm-hmm.
Myers-Briggs, and it's that surprises some people because I'm very
Mm-hmm.
empathetic, but there's all kinds of different types of
Mm-hmm.
empathy, um, and so but I'm a very strong T, and so that I think that
So
has
let me just, for anybody that
led
that,
me
that
through some.
isn't as familiar with those, E is extrovert, right? The T is a thinker. The S is sensory, meaning the
Mhm.
facts, ma'am. Give me the facts, as opposed
Yeah, yeah.
as opposed to intuitive. Now you could be very close, on both of those things. I am very
Hmm.
close on both of the N and the N and S.
I'm close
Okay.
on those.
And
Hmm.
then the P is, well, it's called perceptor,
Perceiving.
but it's not
Yeah.
really about perception. I always like to say the J, the judger, knows how to tell time. The P sometimes is always a little, is,
Yeah.
that's
Exactly.
what it
Yes, that's
is.
me.
Give me a little room here, and the P is very
Yep.
much more spontaneous frequently than the J. Did I get it right?
Yes. You got it
Yeah.
right. Yep. And there's the whole nature versus nurture. Obviously, I majored in sociology, so I attribute a lot of that to my growing up in South America, where time orientation is very different than in the northern parts of the
Hmm.
world. So it's more people oriented and, a little more flexibility. And in Indonesia, they would call it jam karet, which means rubber time. So it's a little flexible on either end. Yeah, which was fine. You kind of, some people, it was harder for them, the Jays, especially who'd grown up in very northern,
Hmm.
colder climates where people are more J oriented. But for me, it was an advantage in those cultures. And, I've had to flex both ways,
Yes.
honestly, depending on where I'm at. But yeah, I would say, yes, I had to be very logical about it, which is, I would say, largely how I do approach most of life, in a very logical way, in a very S way. I want the facts, but I am close like on those. And so I do have a lot of intuition, but I think I didn't realize that I did
Mhm. I
until
was
more
just going to ask you about
recently.
that.
And as I've,
Yes.
yeah, and I think it's, so I think another important part of my upbringing is I grew up in a very religious
Hmm.
environment in both my home and then in my community. So I grew up as a Protestant
Hmm.
Christian in the Southern Baptist denomination, but in Venezuela and Costa Rica, it was very
Hmm.
different than it is in the US. But all that to say, I think that I picked up some messages early on that being a good girl and following all the rules would go better for
Hmm.
me. So I
Hmm.
just did. And some of that could have been being the only daughter as well, being a middle child until my brother was born. We have kind of a big age gap, but still. And yeah, and I just think that I got praised for following the
Hmm.
rules. So that's what I
Hmm.
did. I got the good grades. I was on the honor
Hmm.
roll. I was president of student council, and I just, got a good scholarship to college. I did the
Yes.
things. And then as I've gotten older, I've sort of realized some of those rules that I've started to now process in my further into my career, is that some of those rules were not meant to protect me, but they were meant, rules made by certain people for certain people, to keep voices out of
Yes.
those decisions. And that, I guess the question I've been asking in the last year or so and processing with my therapist and my executive coach is, where are those little, even unwritten
Hmm.
rules that I continue to follow
Hmm.
that are only benefiting others? And so I think another narrative that would be important is I grew up with a very strong servant leadership,
Hmm. Yeah. Hmm.
bent and understanding of leadership, both in my home and this family of nonprofit
Hmm.
workers and that type of thing. And then also living in Southeast Asia for 20 years, where this humility and this service orientation was important, especially for
Yes.
women, and especially for women in the denomination where I grew up in. And so now it's
You're in
been,
Silicon Valley.
you know, I know. I'm in Silicon Valley with a bro club and disruptors. Yeah, disruptors are valued, but are they valued when women are
Hmm.
disruptors? And that's the thing I'm coming up against, is the intersectionality of, where is disruption important to lead
Hmm.
forward? And when a woman does that, we're perceived very differently than when a man does
Yes.
that. So these are things I'm
Yes.
exploring.
Wonderful, wonderful things to explore. And also, just another piece of that, as you're saying, is becoming, I would imagine, the work that you're doing, very closely aligned with your intuition. What does that look like? What does that feel like? How does that guide me? I certainly, for me, I always say that if you took away my intuition, I would be walking around just with a blindfold, just kind of like, you know,
Yeah.
and again, as women, many of us, and again, I was a very good girl as well. Um, Approval was really important. Yeah,
Yeah. Yeah.
and to kind of speak your mind and maybe not be approved of so much. Um, Again, it falls into all those categories of you're a bitch and so on and so on and so on. So we have a lot to navigate. And at the same time, Lori, you're a really great role model. because what we're talking
Thank
about
you.
are real issues for real leaders, and particularly real women leaders. And if we don't pay attention to them, whether it's this culture or that culture, as I said before, you have to listen with very, very big ears, in terms of where am I and who am I listening to and who am I reporting to and who am I, and at the same time, having to listen to yourself.
That's the hard one. And it's the part I'm growing in. And I thank God for my therapist and my executive coach and all these women in
Mm-hmm.
my personal board of advisors who remind me, because I think that is so countercultural to the cultures I've been formed in and even the current one I'm in Silicon Valley. But also, I would say some of the core parts of it that really are embedded in me and I'm trying to be free from are some of the ones from my evangelical
Mm-hmm.
upbringing that taught me not to trust myself. So, that the heart is wicked and these types of things that, may have just been mentioned and maybe not fully cognitively embraced, but somehow are still
Oh,
in me
absolutely.
to say that, oh, and so I think, I am a strong T. We've mentioned
Mm-hmm.
this, the thinking part. And so when we ever did the Myers-Briggs testing and I'd be in a group of people, I remember thinking, oh, I'm so glad I'm a thinker. Those poor feelers, right? Because, which is a terrible thing to think. But I remember thinking, oh, well, at least I'm not like that where I don't have to struggle so much
Mm-hmm.
about, all the feelings and having to work through those. But the reality is I'm
Yes, you
human and I
are.
have
Yes, you.
feelings, but I just didn't trust
Mm-hmm.
those for a very long time. And so looking back, there were situations where my nervous system walking into a room, in a toxic boss situation, my nervous system, my body was telling me all the signs and red
Absolutely.
flags, but I didn't trust it because my brain, and I do get now understanding the parasympathetic nervous system and all these things with the
Mm-hmm.
brain and the body that,
Mm-hmm.
they're connected, but we can separate them, And so now I've done a lot of work to try to integrate that, and I'm still working on that. But to trust myself, to trust my gut has been one of the hardest
Mm-hmm.
things I've ever had to work on doing. And I always say, because I train leadership
Mm-hmm.
development globally, right? I always say that self awareness, self leadership is absolutely hands down for me the hardest part of
Yep.
leadership.
And it all starts with that, right? It all starts with the self,
Yep.
right? Because we are the you know the body that interacts and responds and listens. So if we don't know, it doesn't mean that we have to have everything figured out, because we don't, and many
Right.
times we can't. But what you said is the most important thing, is taking the time to become aware. I always use the definition that I learned of mindfulness as being aware in the present moment without judgment. Right?
So hard.
Yeah, it is. It is. No question. So, but I always work with two little variables that I'll share with you and share with anybody else who's listening to work on getting the judgment out. Number one, I work with two concepts. One is I'm not stupid. I may do stupid things, but I'm not stupid,
Right.
right? And the other is I'm a good person. I may do things that hurt people or inadvertently or do, but if I take those two pieces out and I look at a situation, well, how did I get myself in this situation? Well, I'm not stupid and I'm really a good person. So something else must have been operating. And it opens up the lens. It opens up you know, another way to look at it
Yeah.
that's more objective and less personal.
Hmm. Yeah, it's so good. I think I'll never stop being grateful for having grown up in Costa Rica and Venezuela in these international school environments, and realizing that there's not just two
Hmm.
options. Usually, there's so many options of how to live our lives, of how to lead, how to make decisions, and all of that. And so that I would say has been definitely one of the greatest gifts of my
Hmm.
life. And, growing up in these vastly different cultures and moving as a child so many times. And then anybody listening, if you've been in the international school environment, you'll
I was going to
recognize
bring
this,
that up
that,
as well.
yeah, it's a
It's a
whole
whole
world
world.
where people move about every
Yeah.
2 years. You even if you stay steady from 5th grade to 12th grade. You've had a lot of friends come and go, especially if they're, military
Hmm.
kids in your school. They're usually on a 2-year rotation, but even some of the expat packages are about a 2-year
Hmm.
thing. And so that meant constant change. It meant making friends all the time. And I would say the skills I learned of how to make friends. I was an introvert when I was a younger child, and I changed to be an extrovert. And we can analyze that if we want, but I do see it through a sociological lens, in the sense that in Costa Rica, as a young elementary school girl, I had always made straight A's. And then Don Luis, my teacher, told my parents on the progress report before the report card came out, so it wasn't official, and you can tell what a real follower I am that I'm telling you that, was that, and this, they had a grade on conduct, which isn't, I mean, not even a grade in most schools, but the grade I didn't get an A in conduct, and my parents were like, "Oh no, what's happening? Lori's a good girl, right?" And he basically had a meeting with my parents and said she needs to say buenos dias when she arrives at school. And I'm this little girl having to tell this teacher who's an adult I had to initiate, and I was very shy. And so something in me just switched to be an extrovert, and I am one now. Like, I just like, well, in order to be a good girl and get an A, I guess I'll initiate conversations. Exactly. So you better believe I was saying buenos dias first from then on out.
So just to put that thing on the Myers-Briggs, it's not frozen in stone. These are
Yep.
our most natural tendencies of the way that we are, without any great environmental influences. And then as we grow and as we learn, we can move them and become closer. And I remember one of my sons, I think on a score of 18 or something, 17 was a P and a 1. He is no longer as free flying as he as
Yes.
he was when he was much younger. Lori, you and I, as we could talk and talk and talk about this stuff. It's rich and it's real. And what I love about talking with you and having you be here as sort of a role, not sort of, a role model for leaders, for women leaders, for women and going into different cultures, for being perceptive and respectful, and all the different layers that we have to grow into. As we grow as leaders, we have to grow because we're no longer in this
Yeah.
little box here. Now this is being required of me, and this is being required of me, and and I'm just one person, right? So the things that you're working on and that you continue to work on, and having the mentors and the support system uh, to help you find the blind spots, to help you kind of move beyond and to grow into the next level and the next layer of you. So thank you so much for being here. I appreciate this. We're going to have fun with this. We'll have
Yes. Thank you so much.
my pleasure. All right. And how can people get in touch with you, Lori?
Yes, you can find me on my website, loriadamsbrown.com. I'm also on LinkedIn under Lori Adams Brown. And if you want to check out my podcast, it's called A World of Difference. So you can check it out at aworldofdifferencepodcast.com. I have guests that are authentic leaders across industries, and they come to bring their differences around the table to make a difference together and give us calls to action on how we can lead differently.
Beautiful. Thank you so much. Again, bye for now.
Thank you,
Bye.
Tina. It's
Bye.
been an honor.